Good morning. A good and Erev Rosh Chodesh. Today is Thursday. We're learning Perek Beis and Maseches Challah today. Mishnah is Challah. Today's shiur is sponsored Lila Nishmas. Aaron Nachman Simcha Cohen. Yeshua Mordechai Ben Shep. So Bracha Sabra Shmuel Leib. Emina Moshe Ben Yosef. And the Shemas all have an aliyah. Okay, Perek Beis Mishnah Aleph. We're talking about. We're continuing with Challah. And so the mitzvah challah, the chiyuv challah only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Mishnah is going to discuss the laws of grain that was grown outside Eretz Yisrael, but was made into bread in Eretz Yisrael. So, Mishnah Aleph, Peres chutz la'aretz, shenichnasu la'aretz, produce, in this case grain, grown outside Eretz Yisrael that was brought into Eretz Yisrael and was made into dough there. Chayav b'challah is chayiv in challah. The requirement to separate challah depends on whether the dough is in Eretz Yisrael at the time when the challah obligation takes effect. Since the produce was in Eretz Yisrael at the time, it is subject to challah. Um, um, the Rabbanan, we take challah even outside Eretz Yisrael, but the rice that's only in Eretz Yisrael. Now, Yatsu Mikan Lisham, if the grain went out from here, went out from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, and it was made into dough in Chutz La'aretz, Rabbi Eliezer Mechayev, Rabbi Eliezer obligates a challah on the deraisa level, but even he obligates it on a deraisa level. He holds that grain that grows in Eretz Yisrael is chayiv and challah, even if it was not in Eretz Yisrael when it was actually baked. Rabbi Akiva exempts it. He says that the place where the grain grows is not a factor in creating a challah obligation. Rather, it depends on where it became dough. Since it was made into dough outside Yisrael, there is no chiyuv deraisa to the mafresh challah. Mishnah Beis. Afar chutz la'aretz sheba b'sfina la'aretz. If soil from outside of Eretz Yisrael came on a boat into a river or lake in Eretz Yisrael, chaya b'maisus u'b'shvius. The produce that grows in that soil in the boat is chayiv to the obligations of maisus and shmita. It's because the produce receives nourishment from the ground under the water, and therefore it's considered produce grown in Eretz Yisrael, which is subject to the laws of Meister and Shemitah. So even though the actual soil which the produce grew was not from Eretz Yisrael, it's considered to be produce of Eretz Yisrael because it gets nourishment from the ground of Eretz Yisrael, not necessarily the from the dirt. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Amos, what does this really apply? Bisman she'asfina gosheshes. Only when the bottom of the boat is touching the ground with the water. And that the boat is a very shallow water, and therefore its bottom scrapes against the riverbed. In such a case, the produce in the boat draws nourishment from the ground. However, if the bottom of the boat is not touching the ground, it's very deep waters, the produce does not draw nourishment from the ground. In such a case, it is not considered to be drawing in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, it is exempt from the laws of Meiser and Shemitah. Continuing with Challah, Isa shenilusha b'mei perus, dough that was kneaded with fruit juice. For example, with apple juice. Chayeves b'challah is chayiv in the challah obligation, because fruit juice can bond the separate pieces of flour together to form dough. And the challah that's taken from this dough may be eaten with unclean hands, meaning hands that were not washed, because dough made with fruit juice cannot become tummy. That's very interesting. I wonder what the halach is on that point. Um, he brings down here a mishnah from much later on, um, from Ashirim. You know, from the he brings down from the Rav that from the Bartanura that since there's no concern of the challah being tummy, then the Kohanim don't need to wash their hands, which is probably the cooler why when we eat mazonos, which is usually made with other liquids other than water, well, then we don't wash for that. But this is not a halacha shir, this is Mishnah shir. So if any shayes about the halacha, then so the local Orthodox rabbi. Mishnah Gimel. Isha Yosheves v'kutza chalasa aruma. A woman may sit on the ground and separate challah while she's unclothed. She's able to cover herself. She can sit in a way that her private parts are covered, and therefore she can recite the bracha and mimafresh challah. Aloha ish. This is not the case with a man. A man may not separate challah while unclothed, even if he's sitting on the ground, because a man's private parts are exposed when he sits in this way, which prohibits him from making a bracha on anything. Therefore, he cannot separate challah. Mi she'ena yachal la'asos yisasu b'tahara. Someone who cannot make his dough in a state of tahara because he is tamei, and there is no mikveh available for in which he can be tovel. Yasena kabin. Then he should make the dough in kav portions. He should make the dough in kav portions. Each portion is therefore smaller than the minimum amount, subject to the challah obligation. He may not make the dough instead of tumah. That he cannot knead a dough that's large enough to be chayav and challah, separate challah from it when he's tummy. So that's a problem. Rabbi Akiva says, "Yasena b'tumah v'al yasena kavim." You should make. Rabbi Akiva says no. He argues with him. He says you should make challah, make it in a state of tumah. Make it a large dough that's chayiv and challah, but he may not make it in kav portions that to exempt the dough from the challah obligations. He's saying you can make the B'mafresh challah when you're tummy. Shekashem shehu kari tahora kachu kari tameya. Just as one designates challah for a tahara dough, so too he designates challah for a tummy dough. Lezu kari challah b'shem. Lezu kari challah b'shem. I mean, regarding this one, the dough that's tahor, he assigns the name challah to the portion separated. And he does the same thing for the tamei dough. He could also name it challah. The kav portions, on the other hand, do not have a portion that is assigned the name challah. There's no challah. There's no challah separated from them, and it's more important to have a portion of one's dough sanctified for Hashem than to prevent challah from becoming tummy. Therefore, he can take the challah even though he's tummy. Mishnah Daled. Ha'oseh isaso kavim. Someone makes his dough into kav portions. I mean, he makes two separate doughs, and each one only measures a kav, which is less than the 1.25 kav minimum that's chayav and challah. And the two doughs touched each other. They got combined. When you put them into like a pan, sometimes they connect. Ever so like a tray of like the bokalach that come out of the bakery. There's like 24 rolls on a tray, and they're all separate bokalach, but they're all attached a little bit. So we're talking about that over here. and they're touching each other. Peturim and challah, they are exempt from the chiyuv of challah ad yeshuva until they bite each other, meaning that until they are pressed so firmly together that one will separate the two doughs, and a piece of one dough will be pulled along with the other dough, then that be chai. But those that are really touching each other, however, do not combine to form one dough, since each dough by itself is pater from challah. The doughs remain exempt. Lezer says, "Af harod in the sal." Also, if one bakes the two carb-sized doughs and removes them from the oven and then places the finished breads in a basket, Hasal mitzar from the challah, the basket combines them to be chayiv in etim mafish challah, since both breads together contain the amount necessary to be obligated in the challah. They are subject to challah. Mishnah Hey, Amar frish challah so kemach eino challah. If someone separates his challah from flour, that's not considered challah. Because challah must be taken from the dough, not from the bag of flour. It goes will be a kohen. If he gives this challah to a kohen, it's considered stolen goods in the hand of the kohen, and the kohen must return it. Ha'isa atzma chayos b'challah. The dough itself that the owner needs from the rest of the flour is still chayiv in challah, since the challah separated from the flour was invalid. Therefore, the owner must separate another challah portion from the dough. And regarding the challah flour that was given to the kohen, im yesh bo shiur, if it has the minimum amount that is chayiv in challah, what is 1/4 calves, chayeves b'challah, it is chayiv in challah. Although there's no obligation to separate challah from the portion of challah that's given to a kohen, here the flour is not actually challah. Therefore, the dough needed from this flour is subject to the challah obligation, just like other flour. But through the zarim, and all the flour that was originally given to the kohen as challah is forbidden to non-kohanim. Although the flour is not challah, the chachamim asked it to non-kohanim as if it were challah, because the chachamim were concerned that since the flour is given to a kohen as challah, people would mistakenly think that it really is challah. So therefore, there might be some people who think that it's challah since they saw being given to a kohen, and if the flour would be permitted to non-kohanim, these people would think that non-kohanim may eat challah. Therefore, to prevent this mistake, they asked non-kohanim from eating it. End of story. These are the words of Rabbi Yeshua. The Chachamim said to him, Maisa ukufsha zakin zar. There was an incident in which challah was separated from flour, and an elderly scholar who was not a kohen grabbed it and ate it. And this proved that non-kohanim may eat such challah. So Yeshua responded, that the Torah scholar, in fact, ruined matters for himself. That the scholar, he actually committed a sin by eating the challah and was punished for it. Nevertheless, he did fix matters for others who eat such challah because they based their actions on the Torah scholar to do this act. Therefore, the sin is unintentional. At any rate, the Torah scholar acted incorrectly unless no proof can be brought from his actions, according to Rabbi Yeshua. Mishnah Vav. 5 revaim, which is 1/4 calves, of flour, are chayiv in the challah obligation. Hey, v'sa'oran, v'suban, u'mersanan, chamishes revaim. if the flour, it's sourdough, the fine bran and coarse bran equal 5 chayavin, it is chayav and challah obligation. Sourdough counts toward the challah minimum because it is a normal ingredient added to the dough. Fine and coarse bran, they also count because they are found in bread eaten by poor people. Therefore, they too are considered part of the dough. However, if the coarse bran was removed from these 5 of flour and then put back in, they are exempt from the challah obligation because even poor people do not add bran to their dough by making bread. Thus, such bread is not a normal ingredient in dough and cannot count toward the challah minimum. Moving right along, we got 2 more to go. Dining test. Hang tight. Shiur achala echad me'esrim v'arba. The minimum amount that a private person must give as challah is 1/24 of the dough. That's because the portion one gives as challah must be a significant amount. Unless the 1/24 of a small dough is not significant. Ha'oseh isa la'asmo, ha'oseh l'mishta b'no. However, whether one makes a small amount of dough for himself or a large amount of dough for his son's wedding feast, he must separate 1/24 as challah. Since a private person generally makes a small dough, the Chachamim established the amount of 1/24 for all privately made dough. Thus, even if a private person separates a large amount of dough, prepares a large amount of the dough, he must still separate 1/24. That's the rule. Nachtam shu osa limka b'shuk, a baker who makes a dough to sell it in the market. V'chein ha'isha shehi osa limka b'shuk, and likewise a woman who makes a dough to sell in the market. Echad mi'arbaim v'shmona separates 1/48 of the dough as challah. It's a small amount. So even though 1/48 of a dough is a significant gift, since the baker makes a large amount, then even 1/48 is a significant gift. So when a woman who makes a smaller dough to sell may separate only 1/48, because the rabbis set this as the minimum for all dough made to be sold. When you're baking privately, it's 1/24. When you're baking industrial and you're making lots and lots of dough, 1/48 still adds up to be a lot of dough, and it's a sizable gift. And therefore, that's the rule. According to the Mishnah. Nitmeis isasa shogeges anusa. If a woman who is making bread for her household and her dough became tummy either by accident or or intentionally, I mean, it was unavoidable. Let's say she became nida while she was making dough, and Basara became nida when she was preparing the dough for the malachim, so it couldn't happen. She separates 1/48 of the dough instead of the usual 1/24. It's because since the challah cannot be eaten, then it must be burnt. Therefore, the chachamim were lenient and let it separate the small amount for challah. Nitmes mezida. However, if the dough became tamei intentionally rather than by mistake, she must separate 1/24 as originally required. So that the sinner, that this woman should not profit because of her sin. Had she not sinned, then the dough would have been tahor, and tahor dough for private use is subject to the amount of 1/24. Therefore, so she would have given that away. Now, even though the dough is tamei, she must still separate 1/24 though, so that she cannot benefit from the chait. And finally, Mishnah Ches, Eliezer says, "You tell us when tahor ala tamei challah may be taken for tahor dough for tamei dough, which we don't say by the other manas kahuna. That's a rarity. Ketzad. So how, in fact, is this challah separated without becoming tamei? Isa tahor of isa tamei. If someone has tahor dough and a tamei dough and wants the designated portion of the tahor dough as challah for both doughs, there's the following: no takadei challah. He takes a portion of the dough that's large enough to be challah for both doughs. Isa shalo chalasa. He takes it from the tahor dough if it has not yet had challah taken from it. Then noticing pachas mikabetza be'emsa. He then places a different piece of the tahor dough that's less than an egg's volume between the two doughs, touching both of them. So you have the big one over here, the big one over there, and the little small one over here in the middle. The piece of dough acts as a bridge connecting the two doughs. Then he places the portion of the doughs that will be designated as challah on the bridge, and Gedei Shi'itom and Hamukaf, so he'll be taking challah from something that's close to the doughs. Since the bridge joins the tahor and tamei doughs together, then the challah is considered to be close and actually touching the tamei dough. Nevertheless, the challah does not become tamei because it is touching the bridge and not the tamei dough. The Chachamim Ostrin, the Chachamim said this is usher. You cannot do that, and they said that they held that people might be afraid that the tahor dough will touch the tamei dough directly, and they would therefore designate challah without saying a bridge. Therefore, the chachamim require that challah be separated from the tamei dough itself, and you can't take the tamei for the tahor and the tahor for tamei being consistent with all the other manas kahuna as well. That is the end of today's shiur. We'll continue tomorrow on Rosh Chodesh, later than 9 o'clock. Have a wonderful day. Hold on a second.